You're listening to Talkline with Zev Brenner, America's premier Jewish broadcast on the air since 1981.
And now, here's your host.
Welcome back to the program. I'm Zev Brenner. Very pleased that Dr. Mordechai Kedar joins us again. He's first learned Yiddish. He's a religious Zionist. He has a PhD from Bar-Ilan University. He's fluent in Hebrew, Arabic, English. He's described as one of the few Arabic speakers Israeli pundits seen on Arabic satellite channels defending Israel. And he's an expert in what's happening in Israel and in the Middle East. He's an Israeli scholar of Arab culture and a lecturer at Bar-Ilan, the vice president of Newsrail. So thank you, Dr. Mordechai. Good to speak with you again. It's been a while, and thank you for joining us.
Zev, it's my pleasure, not to mention the honor.
And I know my son told me he enjoyed. You were spent the holiday in Long Beach. I know that people really enjoyed hearing what you had to say. So, Dr. Kedar, let me ask you the question. So it seems that Israel is moving very well with some of the Sunni Arab countries. Saudi Arabia looks like it's going to be next as far as dealing with Israel. May not have formal recognition, but a lot of deals were going on behind the scenes. So there's room for optimism, at least on the Saudi Arabia and Bahrain, Morocco front, UAE front.
Well, it all is a result of what happens with Iran. Because whenever Iran feels more emboldened, especially by the American administration, the Saudis are more afraid. And they are looking for partners with whom they can do some deal against the Iranian expanding influence over the Middle East. Don't forget that Iran, even without nuclear weapons, succeeded to build a great empire. And I'm using the word empire, and I know what to use. This empire actually is comprised of Iran, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, and the state of Gaza, which was established 15 years ago by Hamas. This is actually the Iranian empire, and this empire threatens the Emirates, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, Israel, Jordan, Egypt, and the rest of the Arab world. And this is actually the reason why those countries which feel threatened by Iran, they feel that Israel becomes part of the solution after for many years it was considered to be part of the problem. Now they totally change their view to Israel because of the fear from Iran.
Now, the United States really snubbed Saudi Arabia, and now it needs Saudi Arabia. So what do you make about President Biden going to Saudi Arabia and Israel? Will that change things? Because now it seems like the Americans, our government here, is looking to push the Saudi Arabian-Israel relationship, while before it didn't really pay so much attention to the Abrahamic Accords.
Well, this I think is one of the results of the war between Russia and the Ukraine. Because today, since Europe and America also boycott the Russian oil in order to cripple the Russian economy, now the world needs the other reserves of oil in the world, which are mainly in Saudi Arabia. So because of their hatred to Russia, they might be willing, or they are willing, to accept the membership of Saudi Arabia again in the international club. So this is when you need the thief, you take him off the rope.
That's a Yiddish expression. When you need the gun, if you take him off the gallows. But here's the thing, though. The United States would love to buy oil from Iran, from Venezuela, which is also an option. So is the United States going in the Saudi Arabian direction to go back to try to get it from OPEC? Or at the end of the day, from what I've read, it seems like I said, they're ready to embrace Iran and Venezuelan oil.
Look, when it comes to Iran, maybe Venezuela as well, there are some kinds of laws here in the United States which actually prevent any purchase of oil from Iran. I think that this is by law, by the Congress, and until you change the law, the American government actually is handcuffed when it comes to purchasing oil from Iran. They can maybe lift some sanctions from Iran so Iran can sell energy to other countries. But as much as I understand, it is illegal these days until they change the law, if they can change the law.
But aren't we making ice with Iran? It wasn't a month or so ago that we allowed a different country to pay Iran's bill to the United Nations so they can be in good standing there. So we're doing things to bring Iran back into
yes,
the
and this is exactly what emboldens the Iranians again, and this is as a result what pushes Saudi Arabia towards Israel and the changes which you mentioned before.
Now, you mentioned Russia and you mentioned Ukraine. Now, the fact that Russia has sustained a lot of losses in Ukraine, does that change the picture in Syria? Because Syria is where Russians have forces enabling the Iranians and Hezbollah to operate together with the Assad regime. Does the war change the picture of where Russia stands in Syria?
Well, there were some news about the Russians withdrawing their forces or part of their forces from Syria. I think that this was premature. Even if it happens on a low scale because the Russian presence in Syria continues, and maybe their actions are a little bit reduced. But I'm at all not sure that Russia will give up on what they achieved in Syria, especially the contracts with the Assad regime to get his gas from under the seabed of the Mediterranean as a payment for their involvement in the war to save Assad. So the Russians definitely, they didn't come for free to Syria. They came in order to take over the Syrian gas. And don't forget that the reserves of gas which Syria owns under the sea are apparently bigger than the reserves which Israel has. So Syria potentially can be a very important player in the gas market, which is
Are the Russians exploiting the gas market so far?
Russia is one of the biggest suppliers in the world today.
But are they exploiting the Syrian gas?
Not yet, because they didn't dig yet in order to take it out. But the estimations are that Syria owns gas reserves under the Mediterranean, which are either more or more than what Israel has. So Russia wants to put its hand on this gas in order to prevent a new player who will enter the so far a very small club of gas producing countries, which today is Qatar and Iran and Russia. This is the market. Recently, Israel entered this market. And now, when the world tries to boycott the Russian gas, in addition to the Russian oil, Israel might replace Russia.
Is Israel have adequate supplies to replace Russia?
Yes, the only question is if Israel will be willing to export its gas to Europe and to make money out of it, rather than using it by itself in order to keep the air cleaner. Because if we don't use the gas, the natural gas, we should continue to use coal or oil. And this definitely doesn't contribute to the quality of air here in Israel. So this is actually the considerations which Israel will have to take in account. And don't forget that we don't want to exhaust the sources of gas rapidly because we want to continue to take advantage of this income for long years.
Dr. Mordechai Kedar is our guest, an Israeli scholar of Arab culture, lecturer at Bar-Ilan University. You can see him frequently on Arab TV, including Al Jazeera. Dr. Dar, what about Turkey? Turkey seems, on one hand, they've been antagonistic to Israel. Now they seem to be making a little nice to Israel. They're playing Russia. They seem to be playing a very sophisticated game, one against the other. They're an ally of Russia. They're not supporting Russia. So where are they standing? Because it looks like they're doing all things to be all things to all people.
Well, when it comes to Turkey, once a friend told me, who spent quite a while in Turkey, said that the Turks have only one god, the money. That's
The God of Green.
That's what he said. And as you remember, Liza Minnelli and Joel Grey singing "Money Makes the World Go Around," and here I would even say that money makes Turkey play around. And this actually what happened, because now they are suffering from a very heavy crisis, monetary crisis. The inflation is intolerable. The price of the lira, of the currency, of the Turkish currency, actually in a sharp decline, and the economy of Turkey is in big problems. And Erdogan knows that if the economy goes bad compared to what he had 10 years ago, that he will not be re-elected, and the country will actually throw him to the garbage bin. So he tries everything which he can in order to promote the economy of Turkey, including sitting with his former enemies, the Emiratis, the Bahrainis, the Saudis even, and here Israel also is part of the countries which he would sit with or reassemble his relations with in order to make his economy function better.
Now, there was an Israeli report that Erdogan was really from Jewish stock, or he came from the Shop Sites Free movement, and that's why he's so harsh with Israel. Have you ever seen those theories?
Whenever somebody in Turkey wants to delegitimize somebody else, he claims
He's a Jew.
that he is one of the Dunmes. Dunme is the group of Jews who allegedly converted to Islam after Shabtai Tzvi. So, okay, this is the only way how to delegitimize him. So those who hate him will say that he, like others,
Are there any
descendants of the Dunmans.
Is there any basis to that as far as he's concerned?
I have no idea.
I saw some Israeli journalists talk about it. Speaking of Israel, what's happening? The coalition is hanging on by a thread. People said, oh, it's not going to last. Naftali Bennett won't be able to put together its coalition of right and left with the Arab parties. It seemed to have survived for a considerable period of time. Is the government on its last legs right now?
Look, from the beginning, myself and many other commentators forecasted that this government will not last for long. Of course, it lasted for a year. It is longer than what we expected, but the illnesses of the coalition today definitely were foreseen by many. First of all, this coalition is actually a gathering of marginal parties, because they don't include anything from the center, maybe Lapid, but the Likud, which is today the biggest party in Israel and becomes bigger and bigger every day, is outside, and the religious more or less are outside, and the ultra-religious, the Haredim, are outside. Means that the majority of the Jewish people are outside. This government actually leans on the Muslim Brotherhood from within, the Ra'am party, and on the joint party, the Arab party, from outside the coalition. And this means that this government actually is based on a cooperation between a handful of Knesset members from the Jewish sector and the Arab sector, and within which at least two parties, the Ra'am party, the Islamic movement, actually the party of the Muslim Brotherhood, and the Balad party don't see any reason for the mere existence of the state of Israel. In their view, in their publications, in their websites, in their platform, they keep claiming that Israel is a colonialist state of Jews who ran away from Europe because in Europe it was too dangerous, and they came to the Middle East claiming that they have any history in the Middle East. This is what they see, and this is a colonialist work made by Britain, by France, by other countries, and on the expense of the Arabs. And this is why all the Jews should either return to the countries which they came from, or stay in Palestine, as they call it, under the yoke of the local Arabs. This is what the Jews have no right to a state, especially according to the Islamic tradition and Islamic religion. Jews have no right to sovereignty, to army, police, government, any manifestation of sovereignty. Jews have no right to have. So and for them, the occupation is not something which started in 1967 in the Six-Day War. Occupation is something which started in 1948, which should be abolished. This is, in very short, the essence of the ideology of both Ra'am party and the Balad party. To a degree that Mansour Abbas, the leader of the Ra'am party, the Muslim Brotherhood, even once claimed in Arabic, of course, that they in the Knesset, they actually are waging civil jihad against the state of Israel, since they cannot wage any military jihad because they will be put in jail. So what they do is another kind of jihad, and jihad has many manifestations according to the Islamic tradition. So they are in a civil jihad against the state of Israel. So here we are. This is the problem, and we have to face this situation. And unfortunately, they are part of the government, because some parties like Bennett and Saar and Lapid think that this is appropriate to rely on them. And
it was a coalescence, a coalition because of those that hate Bibi Netanyahu. If
this
Bibi,
is the only
right, the only reason for this government to exist, they hate Bibi.
This is the only common denominator between those parties, the hatred for Netanyahu.
Now, Gideon Saar, who was part of the Likud, he said he would come back if Bibi wasn't there. Will things change in your opinion with some of those that oppose Bibi now come together with him?
If Bibi resigns, from heading the Likud, two things will immediately happen. The one thing is that the current coalition will be dismantled, and the so-called right-wingish parties in this government, means Yamina and Saar, will do their best in order to join the Likud and to have a normal coalition. This is one thing which will happen. Another thing which will happen a bit later might be the dismemberment of the Likud, because the Likud under Netanyahu developed some power centers like Nir Barkat, like Israel Katz, like others, and they might compete with each other on the leadership of the Likud. And if they don't agree, they might actually bring the Likud to dismemberment. This also might be. Of course, they will deny, but this is one of the scenarios which some people forecast for the Likud. As long as Netanyahu is heading in the Likud will remain united. And some commentators claim that Netanyahu remains in the head of the Likud only or mainly in order to keep the Likud as one party, because he knows what will be after he leaves. So this it might be right. And in order to save the Likud, he remains in the head of the Likud, and thus the Likud cannot join the government. Bit complicated,
Right.
but
Whereas if he stays, then those that oppose him don't want to get together with him, so there's an opposition. And if he leaves, then the Likud splinters. Everybody wants to be prime minister. Who do you think is the strongest Likud contender to be prime minister?
depends whom you ask.
I'm
Some
asking
would
you.
say some would ask that Nir Barkat has the most chances to become the leader of the Likud if the Likud remains in one piece. However, there are others who think that Israel Katz has bigger chances to gain the majority of the Likud members as the leader. I personally think that Israel Katz is better because of a different reason. I think that Israel Katz actually frightens the Arabs, especially outside from Israel. And this is what we need. We need a prime minister which will strike terror into the hearts of our enemies. And Israel Katz projects power. He's like a bully. His disadvantage is that he doesn't speak English. And we do need a prime minister who speaks English. So I really don't know whether I support him or not, because first of all, I'm not a member of the Likud. But if you ask me who is the best, I am, I'm with mixed feelings about this. He definitely frightens the Arabs, but he doesn't speak English. How he's going to speak to Biden or to other leaders in the world?
What about someone like Danny Danon? I know he
I,
has.
I think that what happened with Danny Danon was in the refrigerator, means in the United Nations for quite a while, for like 2 and more years. And I'm afraid that he went off the list of the potential leaders of the Likud. Maybe he will have a comeback. I have no idea. But as much as I feel now, he is not one of the candidates to replace Netanyahu.
Because Bibi purposely put him at the United Nations. He didn't want him at home to compete with him.
Yes, because he was so popular within the Likud voters. So Netanyahu expelled him, sent him to Golos, to New York. And of course, he did a very good job as Israel's ambassador to the United Nations. Yet he went off the list of candidates. As much as I feel, I'm not familiar with what goes on behind the scenes in the Likud, but I'm at all not sure that he has the chances which he had before. He was expelled by Netanyahu to the Golos in New York.
Well, he's world chairman of the Likud. I don't know if that helps, but maybe, because he's in charge of the Likud worldwide.
Look, there are Yariv Levin, there are more people in the Likud, but I'm not sure. This is why too many people are afraid or hope, I know, that the Likud will be dismantled after Netanyahu. Maybe this is real. I have no idea.
Dr. Mordechai Kedar is our guest, Israeli scholar of Arab culture, lecturer at Ilan University, and he's actually, you can actually see him on Arabic television and speaking fluent Arabic, defending Israel. Now, Naftali Bennett, who has the prime minister currently, if elections were to be, if the government was to fall apart, he wouldn't be prime minister anymore, it'd be Yair Lapid. So what does that mean? Because originally, if the government survived, it would take about 2 years, if I remember correctly, for Yair Lapid to be prime minister. If the government falls, he's the caretaker prime minister.
I'm not sure, because there are all kinds of scenarios in which Lapid will replace Bennett, even as an interim prime minister. And there are at least one scenario where Lapid will not replace Bennett. It all depends on what happens with the Knesset. If the Knesset decides to go to elections, it will be one of the possibilities. But if the Knesset, as it is today, will shape another government based on the current Knesset, Lapid will not be a prime minister. So it all depends on what the Knesset will decide, whether to dismantle itself and to go to elections, or to remain and to shape another government if there is a possibility to do it.
Now, Israeli society is so split in the last number of elections, and we had quite a few. You had almost 50 right versus left, religious versus the secular parties. So if elections were to be held now, would there be any difference? We would probably see a similar scenario.
Yes, definitely, because what we hear, the polls which are being conducted during the last, let's say, 2 months, 3 months, the Likud and Netanyahu are growing daily. In the current Knesset, they have 30 Knesset members, and now the polls show that they have something between 36 and 38. This is a result of what happened with the files against Netanyahu, which turned to be nothing.
But he's still not out of danger. He still can be indicted. Well, he's been indicted. He can still be exposed to more charges, court cases. He's not out of the woods yet.
Not yet, but so far, what happened is that the case, what they call the file 4000, which, according to which he allegedly took bribery from one of the companies, from the communications company, Bezek, turned to be tailored very roughly by the prosecution, because the main witness actually, who was supposed to strengthen the prosecution line, actually weakened it dramatically, to a degree that the prosecution asked the court to change the allegations against Netanyahu, but the court did not agree. And this is a very hard blow to the.
But Dr. Kedar, this is only one case. You have a submarine case. You have other cases too. That,
okay, but
right?
one case will fall. By the way, this is why they started with this 4,000 file, because it looked to the prosecution as the easiest. Turned to be that this is the hardest from the prosecution point of view. So if this is the easiest, what will be the others? So little by little, and more people understand that the whole thing about the trials against Netanyahu are concocted by the prosecution. And this actually what pushes people who once were against Netanyahu to support him. This is one thing. Second thing, what happened is during the last year, this coalition of today actually relies on the Muslim Brotherhood in the coalition and the other Arab parties from outside the coalition. And this is something which vast majority of the Jews do not agree. And this behavior of Bennett and Lapid definitely pushed many people to leave them. And I think that today, both Bennett and Lapid will not pass the threshold. They will fail in the elections. And unfortunately, they will take with them to the garbage some thousands of voters from the right side of the political map, unfortunately. So it all depends if there is another round of elections or not. And what will happen?
Looks like there will be another round, right? That's what it seems like. The government is hanging on by a thread. They've lost one or two.
Again, if they're losing more and more Knesset members who belong to Yamina, Bennett, and to Tikva Hadasha, the New Hope of Saar, might leave Bennett and Saar in order to join a government, in order not to, just like mice who run away from a ship before it sinks. And if this happens, they can have a normal government without any elections.
Dr. Mordechai Kedar, international speaker. He's at Bar-Ilan University. He's sought out all over, including on Arabic television, where he speaks in Arabic to defend Israel. We appreciate you joining here with us. Thank you for being part of our show.
Zev, thank you very much for giving me the pulpit. And see you again.
God willing.
Thanks for listening. For continuous Jewish programs, TalklineNetwork.com. We're our 24-hour-a-day listen line at 641-741-0389. For past shows, you can find us on iTunes, Spotify, Amazon, YouTube, Instagram, and all major podcast platforms, or jewishpodcast.org. Thanks for listening to the TalklineNetwork.com.
Thanks for